tapeworm is a particularly nasty parasite. In 60% of the diagnosed cases of pork tapeworm, the victim has cysts inside the brain. And when you have a cyst in your brain, very bad things can happen. You can have seizures, coma, hallucinations, or possibly even death. Where sanitation is not very good, this parasite can be very common. In some parts of the world, up to 6% of the population harbor this parasite.
In most cases, humans get the parasite by eating contaminated pork. But a few get infected when they come in contact with egg-laden human feces.
If you eat undercooked pork, you end up with a tapeworm in your gut. But if you eat the eggs that have been passed out in feces, then you can end up with the cysts in your tissues, and that can be a lot worse.
The pork tapeworm is one of the most common parasites to affect humans. It infects over 50 million people worldwide.
One of the reasons that the pork tapeworm is so nasty is that once it forms a cyst inside the brain, it's almost impossible to kill.
The good news is I don't have cancer.
That's also surprising news because doctors at Mount Sinai Hospital thought just the opposite until last September when neurosurgeons opened up Rachel Palma's skull. They fully expected to find a marble-sized malignant brain tumor. Instead, they found a parasite. It was January of last year when strange things started happening to the 42-year-old from Middletown. She'd suddenly drop her coffee mug. She couldn't remember words. She tried calling deceased relatives. After countless doctor visits and numerous brain scans, specialists at Mount Sinai found the problem and developed a plan of attack, a 3-hour surgery.
This is the lesion. Right, and you can see how it enhances this very bright white here, and inside of it is dark.
Yep.
And you see the same thing here.
The big mystery to this story, how the parasite got there. The patient never traveled outside the United States. She doesn't recall eating uncooked meat. Frankly, she's given up trying to find an answer.
I stopped asking questions and started celebrating and making the most out of life, because in an instant it can be taken away.
Pork tapeworm named Teniasolium. Teniasolium, the pork tapeworm, has emerged as an important infection not only in many developing countries, but also in the United States as well. The parasite is particularly prevalent in Central America and in Mexico, and now the organism has been imported over the border to the point where it has become a major infection in U.S. cities that are near these countries. So we find high rates of T-solium infection in Los Angeles, in San Diego, in San Antonio, and Tucson, Arizona. The reason this is of importance to note is because the larval stages of the pork tapeworm have been linked to an illness in the brain. There is a syndrome associated with Teniasolium known as neurocysticercosis that has now become one of the leading causes of epilepsy among children living in these cities in the southwestern United States.
The pork tapeworm, the egg, when it's ingested into the human, the larva that emerges from that egg and thinks it's in a pig, the larva will go and encyst in various parts of the human anatomy. Unfortunately, including, and apparently the parasite seems to have a tropism for human neural tissue. So you can get cysts in the brain, you can get cysts in the eyes, you can get cysts in the musculature.
Mexico City's Institute of Neurology and Neurosurgery. Dr. Carlos Marquez watches a moment in medical history, the first ever successful cultivation in a laboratory of the Teniasolium, one of the world's most deadly parasites. The experiment probably saved the life of this woman, Alejandra Cabreras. Eggs from the parasite had lodged in her brain, resulting in a condition known as cysticercosis.
First I found I kept dropping things from my right hand. I didn't feel it, but when I looked, things weren't there anymore. Then there was my leg. I'd be sitting down. I'd want to get up and I just couldn't. I couldn't use my leg.
Cerebral cysticercosis is the most common parasitical disease of the nervous system in the whole world.
It causes inflammation of the brain and leads to a host of other brain disorders. In Alejandra's case, a stroke. The parasite grows to more than 1 meter in the human intestine. But how it infects the brain is part of a complex cycle. Key to that cycle is the pig. The Taenia solum lays microscopic eggs in the human intestine. These eggs are excreted into the environment. Feeding from human rubbish and waste, the pigs eat the eggs. The eggs then gestate into the flesh of the pig, which is eaten by humans, completing the cycle. Cysticercosis occurs when humans eat the eggs direct, through contaminated vegetables or water. Not having gestated, the eggs are unable to grow into parasites in the intestine. Instead, they lodge in the brain and become cysts, like these. This one has grown behind a human eye.
We're having a party at a park, and it's a summer day. It's really, really hot, and Wendy starts feeling bad. She wasn't able to continue to play, so we decide to leave. I'm kind of in shock because this headache just keeps getting worse. I decide to take her to the emergency room. They do a physical test, they check my eyes. And so they're telling me that my headaches are coming from being out in the sun all day and being dehydrated.
But Wendy's sister Paula isn't so sure.
I don't think that this is just a regular headache. I think it's more to it, so I demand for the doctors to do an MRI.
The MRI scans reveal that Wendy's brain has started to swell. It is under attack.
After several hours, they return and they tell me that I have 10 to 15 parasites around my brain. I'm shocked.
The parasites in Wendy's brain are encysted pork tapeworms. The pork tapeworm has two hosts, humans and pigs. The parasite forms cysts in the tissues of a pig. If a human eats undercooked pork that contains the cysts, they get infected. In the human gut, the cysts hatch into adult tapeworms, where they can grow up to several meters long. The adult worms lay eggs that are passed in human feces. The eggs developed into larvae that burrowed into her brain and formed cysts. For years, these cysts lie dormant and produce no symptoms. But slowly, the cysts start to grow, releasing toxins into the tissue.
Rosemary Alvarez savors every minute with her kids.
That was a good throw.
Playing ball and laughing. For this mom, each day with them is a gift after coming too close to death last August.
I thought I had the flu. I started feeling tired.
But within days, this soccer coach and PTA president knew it wasn't the flu.
I started feeling numbness in my left arm, blurred vision. I'm still smiling for my kids, but now I can't get out of bed.
2 trips to the ER solved nothing.
CAT scan came back normal, no problem.
But her husband, George, was scared.
She couldn't eat. She could barely walk to the bathroom. So I knew at that point, she was deteriorating really quick.
It all came to a head on the first day of school as their kids aged 9 through 17 headed back to the classroom. Their mom was in an ambulance headed to Barrow Neurological Hospital after an MRI explained those strange symptoms.
It came back. You have a brain tumor. At that exact moment where my heart fell just completely all the way down.
But the news would get worse. Neurosurgeon Dr. Peter Nakaji.
Once we saw the MRI, we realized this is not good. It's something down in her brainstem, which is as deep into the brain as you can be.
Dr. Nakaji was expecting to find a brain tumor. He showed me the video as he operated on Rosemary's brain, carefully working, knowing this is the most dangerous spot in the human body to work next to, the brainstem.
Here's the lump, and at this point it still looks like a brain tumor, and so we're just opening up into the inside.
And then the unexpected. No tumor, instead a worm. Watch as Dr. Nakaji grabs the worm and gently tugs it out of Rosemary's brain. It's still alive. This worm comes from eating undercooked pork, but more frighteningly, it can be spread by people who have the parasite in their bodies and don't wash their hands well after using the bathroom. That is the problem.
And it only takes one person who is spreading it constantly to get a lot of people exposed, and some of those people are going to go on to develop this problem.
It's impossible to pinpoint exactly when Rosemary contracted this brainworm.
Probably she was one of these very unfortunate people who had somebody handle food for her, that she ingested it, and it got to her brain.
What is normally a rare occurrence has become much more common. Dr. Nakaji has removed 5 of them in the past few months, and other doctors at Barrow, they're seeing more of them too.
I think it could be a fluke, but it does concern me that if we see more and more cases, as one person is infected and starts to spread these, it spreads it to other people who become infected, and then they spread it, so that more people are at least at risk.
Meantime, George and Rosemary are stunned, relieved, and a bit creeped out by it all.
It could have ate holes in her brain like an apple.
Okay, so we're just at the start of the small intestine, and we can just about see, this is the first glimpse of one of the tapeworms. This worm is probably between 1 and 2 meters in length. You can see how closely the worm is associated with the intestine. We have the wall of the intestine closing in around the worm, so very tightly adhered to it. The segments themselves increase in size as we move down the length of the worm. So this is still quite near the front end because these segments are quite shallow. Okay, I think we can see some much bigger segments here. This is further down the length of that worm, getting towards the back end of it. The segments get bigger, they get more mature. Here we've got the biggest segments here. So these segments are probably about 1 centimeter or so in size, and again dipping back down into the back parts of the intestine. Okay, so here we have a fairly sexually mature segment here. It's ready to start producing eggs, and the animals themselves self-fertilize, so there are male and female parts within this segment, and self-fertilization takes place. The whole of the segment will then become completely full of eggs and will eventually detach from the worm and pass out in the fecal material, and that's how the animal reproduces. Okay, so here's the very end of that worm. This is the last segment which has been produced. They would have started off as very small segments near the neck of the parasite, and as the parasite gets older, they become further back and become more mature, bigger. These are the oldest ones which are occurring in the intestine. Okay, as we move further down the intestine, we come across the second of the 2 tapeworms, and it's quite interesting to note that the position of these worms, they're not exactly together. They're spaced out along the intestine, so they're sort of avoiding each other to some extent and finding a different part of the intestine to inhabit. The length of the small intestine is about 7 meters in an adult human. These worms can maybe get up to about 10 meters in length. So the worm itself, quite often when it's fully mature, is very folded and coiled up, so that it's taking up a bit less space in the intestine. Inside each segment are quite significant muscle systems, and they can actually move to different parts of the intestine, be detaching and then reattaching to the wall. We're now moving to the third worm. Here we can see the actual very front end of the worm. This is called the scolex, and we can actually see there are 4 suckers. So these suckers grasp onto the wall of the intestine, and they hold the worm in place. Other tapeworms might have some hooks around the top as well, which they sort of anchor into the intestinal wall.
Carlos Faxas has a big smile on his face as the nurses at Tampa General Hospital move him to surgery, and with good reason. After suffering 8 months with a condition no one could diagnose, relief is in sight.
One day, I just got up and I started seeing something brown inside my eye, you know, like a stain. So I said, I have to go to the doctor.
Carlos lived in the Dominican Republic and spent months seeing doctor after doctor. Some even told him the spot would be there forever, and to just look past it. It wasn't until Carlos moved back to Tampa and found Dr. Don Perez that this medical mystery was solved.
He said, did you eat a lot of pork? Because this comes from the pork drinking water, I guess, with this virus is in it or whatever, you know. And then when you eat the meat, you get the virus.
Dr. Perez discovered Carlos's problem, a parasitic tapeworm. The larvae somehow moved through his intestines and into his eye, growing into a full-size adult worm.
As the worm grows, it hasn't caused any reaction. This is very rare.
Dr. Perez removed the worm using a 25-gauge needle without causing any damage to Carlos's eye. You can see the worm being sucked up in this video.
After weeks of suffering from seizures, a Chinese man went to the doctor where it was discovered he had hundreds of tapeworms in his brain and chest. Asia Wire reports that Zhu Zhangfa had previously eaten undercooked pork, which contained a parasitic tapeworm. The man's doctor, Dr. Huang Zhanrong, told Asia Wire that the patient had been suffering from seizures and losing consciousness. Larvae from the contaminated meat traveled from Zhangfa's digestive system to other parts of his body via the bloodstream, explained the doctor.
What is this? Well, it's easily recognizable as regular old skeletal, striated, voluntary muscle for all the right reasons. First of all, you can see that the fibers are generally parallel to each other. You could see that, I hope you could see nuclei, but you could hope that the nuclei are generally oriented towards the periphery. Unfortunately, we don't see nuclei very good in this stain, but you can appreciate the fact that these fibers are very nicely parallel to each other. Let's find the individual fiber and see if we could find striations. And I hope we can, because if we can, I'm going to point them out to you, because really, there can't be anything but skeletal muscle. What kind of hits your eye, though, now that you kind of know this is routine, boring skeletal muscle, is that there are areas like here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, which do not look like they belong to a skeletal muscle at all. They look like they're very dark or perhaps calcified. They have that same staining. And they look like they're very distinct and very oval, and they're of various sizes and slightly different shapes. And if the first thing that you think of when you look at this is that it really doesn't look like any other human type of tissue you've ever seen, it's because you're right. This is not human tissue. This is the larva of the roundworm of Trichinella spiralis, the parasite, the roundworm parasite that you get from eating inadequately cooked pork. And even though this organism has various complex life cycle and various forms within the body, these are what you might find in skeletal muscle as a calcified oval cyst within skeletal muscle. Let's look at a couple of more. Here's another one, looking very calcified and very unhuman, like nothing you would ever see before in a human histology lab. Let's see if we could find some more, because we know there were some more. Here's another one. Here's probably another one here. And notice they just look kind of hyalinized. They look like they're calcified in the center or even towards the periphery sometimes. And this is a classical encysted cyst of trichinosis within skeletal muscle.